The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song at 2 in the morning, and Margaret Walsh moved through them like a woman who had learned long ago that silence was safer than speaking. Her hands glided across the supply cart, gauze pads, trauma shears, for tubing, saline flushes, each item placed with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her current life. 23 years as a civilian nurse, but the ordering of supplies still felt like prepping a field hospital, inventory checked, locations memorized, nothing wasted. The hospital smell, antiseptic layered over something underneath that was always human, always blood and fear and hope, had stopped bothering her around year 2. Now it was just the smell of work. Seattle General's cardiac unit occupied the 4th floor of the Houston Tower, a place where people came to have their broken hearts fixed or to accept that breaking was all that remained. Margaret's silver hair was pulled back in a braid so tight it pulled at her temples, and her slight limp was barely noticeable as she moved from room 308 to 309 to 310, checking vitals on patients who barely registered her presence. That was how she preferred it. She'd spent 3 years on this night shift, moving like a deliberate ghost through corridors where nobody expected her to be anything but invisible. The other nurses avoided her in the break room. That part had taken longer to accept, but the patients never complained. They remembered her hands. Hands that never shook. Dr. Caldwell arrived on morning rounds at 6:47, his shoes polished to the kind of shine that only came from certainty. He was 42, built like someone who paid a personal trainer to remind him he mattered, and his eyes carried the specific glaze of ambition that Margaret recognized from 20 years in uniform. He wanted something bigger than this hospital. That want was written across his face like a banner. She'd seen that look before in officers who climbed over corpses to make rank, and she'd learned to stay out of their way. The problem was that staying out of his way became impossible when he was wrong. Mr. Patterson in room 312 had been admitted 47 hours earlier with a post-MI arrhythmia, myocardial infarction, heart attack, the body's way of saying enough, and Margaret had been monitoring his cardiac strips with the kind of attention that came from knowing what deterioration looked like before it announced itself. His chart showed he'd been on metoprolol for blood pressure control, a beta blocker that did its job quietly, keeping his heart rate steady at 68 beats per minute. His potassium levels were borderline low at 3.2, nothing dangerous but worth noting. She'd written it in her assessment: patient stable, slight electrolyte deficit, monitor for QT prolongation. When Dr. Caldwell swept into room 312 with his residents trailing like remoras behind a shark, Margaret was finishing her notes at the bedside. Mr. Patterson's son stood by the window, Korean War veteran, 84 years old, visiting his own son who was fighting a different kind of battle, one without uniforms or clear enemies. Margaret had learned that the families were often sicker than the patients. Continuing the metoprolol, Caldwell announced, not asked, his voice the kind that filled a room without trying. And I want to add dobutamine to improve contractility. Margaret's hand stopped moving. Dobutamine was an inotrope, a medication that forced the heart to work harder, pushing it toward greater force of contraction. In a patient already on metoprolol, with potassium already running low, the interaction was a mathematical certainty. The dobutamine would drive potassium even lower, and low potassium plus a stimulated heart equaled an arrhythmia cascade. QT prolongation sliding into torsades to points. Sudden death disguised as bad luck. She'd seen it happen twice in her military days, both times in field hospitals where there was no mechanism to reverse it, just the sound of the monitor flatline and the understanding that nothing you did would bring them back. She set down her pen. Doctor, patient's potassium is 3.2. Dobutamine will lower it further. The resident stared at the wall. Mr. Patterson's son shifted his weight. The fluorescent lights buzzed their indifferent song. Dr. Caldwell's smile didn't change. The potassium is acceptable. Not with inotropic support, Margaret said. Not with his cardiac history. Her voice came out exactly level, exactly respectful, exactly the kind of voice that should have made sense to anyone listening. Recommend potassium repletion before. I'll note your concern. His pen moved across the chart with the finality of a door closing. Continue current plan. She could have pushed harder. In her old life, she would have. She would have used her rank and her experience and the bone-deep certainty that comes from keeping soldiers alive under fire, and she would have made him listen. But the old life was behind enough barriers that Margaret had learned to treat it the way she treated her own scars, acknowledge them in private, hide them in public, and move on. She nodded and stepped back, just far enough to be out of the way but close enough to hear whatever came next. What came next was something she almost didn't recognize in herself, the decision to let him be wrong. But not alone. Margaret waited until the rounds moved on, until Caldwell was examining the patient in 314 and the residents were crowding around a chart like surgeons over a body. Then she walked back into 312, where Mr. Patterson was sitting up in bed and his son was standing with the weight of 84 years pressing down on his shoulders. "I need to call this in," she said quietly. "Your potassium level and the medication he ordered. There's going to be a problem if we don't adjust." Mr. Patterson's son looked at her for the first time. Really looked like she wasn't furniture. "Are you sure?" 12 years in emergency medicine, she said, which was technically true if you counted field hospitals where the emergency was continuous and the medicine was whatever you could improvise from what didn't blow up with you. "Yes, I'm sure." She made the call to the attending physician, not Caldwell's superior, someone lateral but with the authority to question orders, and explained the interaction in the kind of technical language that left no room for argument. By the time Caldwell came back from round 7, the attending had already written a new order, potassium supplementation first, dobutamine only if levels normalized. The attending had also made a note in the chart that flagged the concern as appropriately raised by nursing staff. That note was the mistake. Not Margaret's mistake. Caldwell's face went through a sequence of expressions like a film reel, confusion, then recognition, then anger that he covered so fast most people wouldn't have seen it. But Margaret saw it because she'd been trained to read the micro-movements of men who were about to decide your life wasn't worth living anymore. She held her ground, her posture exactly neutral, her eyes exactly level, her hands exactly at her sides like they weren't trembling. Except they weren't trembling. That was the thing about the old skills, they didn't fade. They just got quieter. "My office," Caldwell said. 2 o'clock. "We need to discuss scope of practice." She nodded and said nothing. The silence was her mistake. She should have defended the medication catch, should have explained her reasoning, should have given him an explanation he could accept without losing face. But she'd learned that explanations rarely helped when someone had already decided how the story ended. Better to wait for the next chapter. The next chapter arrived at 1:58 with the rest of Mr. Patterson's family, his wife of 56 years, his 3 daughters, and a grandson who was old enough to understand that hope didn't always have a happy ending. They were sitting in the family conference room off the cardiac unit when Dr. Caldwell entered at 2 o'clock sharp. Margaret was there because he'd told her to be, and because questioning a direct order was something she'd learned not to do about 2 minutes after joining the United States Army Medical Service. "I wanted to discuss what happened this morning," Caldwell began, his voice gone into that register that doctors used when they needed to sound sympathetic while delivering bad news. Margaret here questioned a medication order in front of the patient and his family. "That's not appropriate." The wife's hands went together in her lap. The daughters exchanged glances. The grandson stared at his shoes. Margaret's breath came in exactly the same rhythm it had for the last 23 years, steady, measured, deliberate. The thing about being trained to work under fire was that this public recalibration, this rewriting of the narrative, felt slower than it actually was. She could see it coming from miles away. "Nurses don't override physicians," Caldwell said, his eyes moving to the family like he was establishing an alliance. "Even well-meaning nurses. Especially not confused ones." He paused, let the word sit in the air like a smell. "Margaret's been here 3 years, and while we appreciate her dedication, the fact is she's not current on the latest protocols. She was before her time, perhaps. Now she's past her prime. We need to make sure that doesn't endanger patients." Mr. Patterson's eldest daughter opened her mouth. Closed it. The wife's hands pressed harder together. Margaret felt the words like they were coming from underwater. "Confused." Past her prime. They landed somewhere in the middle of her chest and stayed there like shrapnel you couldn't quite dig out without causing more damage than leaving it alone. She didn't flinch. Didn't shift her weight. Didn't let her jaw tighten by more than a millimeter. She kept her eyes on a point 3 inches above Caldwell's left shoulder and imagined the kind of stillness that came from lying in a burnt-out building waiting for a clearance that might never come. I want to be clear, Caldwell continued, and now his voice had taken on that professional warmth that was worse than anger because it was calculated. Margaret's concern was well-intentioned. But in the future, if there's an issue with a medication order, the appropriate channel is to speak with me privately. Not in front of patients. Not in front of their families. That undercuts the therapeutic relationship and creates doubt about the plan of care. The grandson finally looked up. He was maybe 17, old enough to know when an adult was making something sound reasonable that wasn't reasonable at all. The medication combination was dangerous, Margaret said. Her voice came out exactly as calm as if she was reading a report to a brigade commander. Potassium depletion plus inotropic support. QT prolongation. Torsades to points. The attending agreed. The attending was kind enough to accommodate an alternative approach, Caldwell said, and now the warmth in his voice had curdled into something else, something that tasted like medicine gone bad. Which was not necessary. But we'll move past this. I think you're probably tired. Night shifts, they do things to the mind. Make you second-guess yourself. Make you less reliable. He stood up, which was the signal that he was done with this room and these people, and whatever happened next was their responsibility. Let's chalk this up to overwork and call it a teaching moment. He left before Margaret could respond, which meant there was no opportunity to respond, which meant the last thing the family heard was his version of events settling into their minds like sediment in water. The wife's hands finally unclenched. The eldest daughter stood to leave. The grandson kept staring at his shoes, and Margaret understood that he would remember this moment for a very long time, and when he was grown up and working in some office where someone tried to humiliate him publicly, he would either do what Margaret was doing now, hold still and wait for the story to change, or he would burn the whole thing down. Margaret didn't know which was braver. Mr. Patterson's son walked her out of the room, into the hallway where the hospital sounds condensed into something almost beautiful if you could forget what they meant. I know what you did, he said quietly. My father served in Korea. 74 years ago now. He taught me to recognize people who are willing to do the hard thing when nobody's watching. He paused. The question is why you didn't fight back harder. Margaret touched the inside of her jacket where the patch lived, that faded square of fabric sewn so carefully into the lining that nobody ever found it unless they were looking specifically for it. The patch was 20 years old now, the edges starting to fray. It said 10th Mountain Division in letters that had almost faded into the green, and she'd kept it the way other people kept photographs, not because she wanted to remember, but because forgetting felt like betrayal. In Tikrit, she said, and her voice came from somewhere much deeper than her chest, somewhere dark enough to echo, I learned that you fight the battles you can win and accept the ones you can't. The ones you can't win are usually the ones that matter most. She looked at him, really looked, and saw his father's eyes in his face. Your son's going to be fine. That's the battle that matters. He nodded slowly, like he was understanding something he'd never been able to ask. Then he went back into the room where his family was learning that certainty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Margaret clocked out an hour later and walked into the Houston afternoon, her leg aching in that particular way it did after long shifts, the phantom pain that had been her companion since the IED took half her hip and all of her previous life. She'd been a major once. She'd led soldiers through streets where every shadow could kill you. She'd pulled a bleeding 8-year-old girl from a burning vehicle and kept her breathing until the medevac arrived, and that girl had survived and probably never thought about the medic whose hands had been steady enough to save her. The world moved on. People forgot. Stories got rewritten by people like Dr. Caldwell who needed them to fit into shapes that made sense of their own ambition. Margaret had learned to live in the space between truth and the stories people told about it. It was a tight space, and getting tighter. But she'd survived worse accommodations. She didn't know that in exactly 48 hours, that girl, now promoted to Admiral Sarah Chen in dress whites, would collapse in room 447 with a blood clot nobody saw coming, and everything she'd learned about silence and acceptance would become suddenly, violently insufficient. She didn't know that her old life was about to walk through a hospital door and demand her back. All she knew was that the break room was going to be empty again tonight, and that was how she preferred it. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and regret on a Tuesday morning when Margaret Walsh learned what silence tasted like. She pushed through the door at 6:41 a.m., a shift starting in 13 minutes, her scrubs still carrying the antiseptic residue from the night before. 4 nurses sat around the small table near the window: Rebecca, Tom, Jessica, and Marcus. The ones who used to ask her about her weekend. The ones who'd laughed at her dry jokes about difficult patients. The ones who were human. Rebecca looked up first. Then her eyes slid away. Margaret set her bag on the counter and reached for a mug, the chipped one that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. She'd owned it for 7 years. She'd brought it from home specifically because nobody else would want it, and today she needed to hold something familiar. The scrape of chairs. Quick as gunfire. "Come on, we should head down," Rebecca said to no one in particular, her voice pitched high and bright and false. Tom stood without finishing his coffee. Jessica grabbed her badge. Marcus looked at his shoes as he passed Margaret's shoulder, close enough that she could have reached out, far enough that he wouldn't have to acknowledge her. The door closed behind them with a soft hydraulic hiss. Margaret stood alone at the counter, the mug warm in her hands. She didn't set it down. She didn't move. She simply stood there, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz like insects trapped behind plastic, and waited for her heart rate to stabilize. 3 breaths. 4. The exercise her old commanding officer had taught her, the one that worked in mortar fire and apparently worked just as well when your colleagues decided you didn't exist. She'd expected this. She'd seen it coming the moment Dr. Caldwell's face had flushed in room 312, the moment he'd smiled at Mrs. Patterson with practiced sympathy and called her confused. But knowing something was coming and actually standing alone in a break room where people had just abandoned full cups of coffee, those were different calculations entirely. By Wednesday, it happened again. By Friday, she was eating lunch in her car in the parking lot, watching nurses walk across the asphalt in clusters of 3 and 4, their laughter carrying through the closed windows like accusations. The isolation wasn't violent. It was worse than violence. Violence was quick. This was the slow erasure of someone standing in plain sight. But that wasn't the worst part. Thursday morning, Margaret arrived for her 7 a.m. rounds and found the unit board had changed. The white piece of paper with the pink border, the official one, had been posted directly above the patient roster where every nurse, every resident, every attending who did rounds would see it. Her name. In bold letters. The document was dated the previous Monday. She read it twice, her eyes tracking the language with the precision of someone who'd learned to parse military jargon where the difference between one word and another meant the difference between court-martial and commendation. Insubordination. Failure to respect chain of command. Disregard for established hospital protocols. Each phrase was carefully selected, each one true in the way that lies constructed from partial truths were always the most dangerous. Margaret had seen enemies try to dismantle her before. She'd just never seen it done with such careful penmanship and hospital letterhead. She unclipped the notice from the board, not to remove it, just to read it again. The handwriting wasn't Caldwell's. HR. Which meant he'd already gone through the system. Which meant he'd planned this. Which meant she was no longer dealing with a man acting on impulse. She was dealing with someone playing chess. She clipped the notice back into place and continued her rounds. By 9:15 a.m., during the attending physician walkthrough, Dr. Caldwell called her into the hallway outside room 416. They were between patients. 3 residents hung back, pretending to review charts. 2 visiting cardiologists stood near the elevator, waiting for the tour to continue. Caldwell had timed this perfectly, public enough to matter, private enough to deny if she pushed back. His voice was reasonable. Almost kind. "Margaret, I wanted to touch base with you about something I've been noticing." He gestured down the hallway, his posture relaxed, his expression that of a concerned mentor. "This role, the cardiac unit, the intensity of critical care, it's a lot. I've been in medicine long enough to know that not everyone thrives at the same level throughout their career. It's nothing to be ashamed of." Margaret kept her eyes level. She could feel her pulse in her wrists, but her breathing remained even. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The same rhythm she'd used in Fallujah when IEDs were coming in faster than they could triage. "You're an excellent nurse," Caldwell continued, and the word nurse came out like he was describing her job title, not her competency. "Perhaps outpatient clinic would be more your speed. Routine follow-ups. Lower acuity. Somewhere your limitations won't put patients at risk. We can make the transition smooth. No performance issues on your record if you go voluntarily." He smiled. It was a smile that said he'd already won. That he knew something she didn't. That her response didn't matter because the decision had already been made. That's when Margaret felt it, the single drop of water tracking down her left cheek. Just one. She didn't tremble. She didn't look away. She reached up with her thumb and wiped it away with the kind of deliberate precision she usually reserved for starting and for in a vein no thicker than a hair, and when she met Caldwell's eyes again, something inside those eyes flickered. Surprise. Confusion. He'd been expecting tears. He'd been expecting her to break. Her voice, when it came, was steady as surgical steel. "Tikrit. 2004, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I triaged 847 patients in 72 hours after an IED took out the primary field hospital. I've held the bleeding together when bleeding was the only thing we had, the only thing between breathing and not breathing." She paused. Her hand stayed at her side. "A bruised ego won't send me running, doctor. I've survived worse than your opinion of me." Caldwell's jaw tightened. The three residents suddenly became very focused on their charts. One of the cardiologists glanced back. She was a woman in her 60s with grey streaked through her black hair, and her eyes held something like recognition. "I'm going on break," Margaret said quietly, and she walked past him toward the elevator, her spine straight, her hand steady, her voice already transforming into something harder and more precise than the deferential nurse who'd been quietly correcting his medication orders just days before. What he didn't know, what nobody in that hallway knew, was that the patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the faded piece of 10th Mountain Division insignia she kept tucked beneath her scrubs where no one could see it, had been pressed against her heart during that conversation. What he didn't know was that she'd survived an IED that shattered her hip and ended her military career, and that she'd spent 18 years learning how to be small again, how to take orders instead of give them, how to make herself disappear into the role of just a nurse because the alternative, letting people see who she actually was, had felt like begging. What he didn't know was that Admiral Chen was upstairs in cardiac observation, recovering from routine testing, and that in exactly 47 minutes, she would call her corpsman with a question about a medication side effect. What he didn't know was that this admiral, this woman in dress whites who'd trained the last 3 years to be unshakable, had been 8 years old in Tikrit when a medic with steady hands pulled her from a burning vehicle and held her breathing together long enough for a medevac to land. What he didn't know was that his next decision, to clear that patient's discharge over Margaret's objections, was about to end everything. The elevator doors slid shut. Margaret watched the floor numbers climb. 2, 3, 4. Behind her, Dr. Caldwell was probably returning to his rounds, already composing the next move in his campaign of careful erasure. He had no idea that the quiet nurse in the worn scrubs carried a Bronze Star with Valor in her medical record, that she'd kept 17 soldiers breathing under mortar fire, that her restraint over the past 2 weeks hadn't been weakness, it had been the iron discipline of someone who'd learned to survive by staying invisible. But invisibility was about to end. And when it did, everyone in this hospital would finally understand what Margaret Walsh had known about herself all along. Admiral Chen arrived at Seattle General on a Tuesday morning wearing full dress whites, the uniform crisp as a blade, her shoulder boards catching the fluorescent light like mirrors. She moved through the cardiac unit with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, spine straight, eyes forward, the kind of posture that made people step aside without being asked. Room for 47 was prepped. Margaret had checked the file twice. Routine follow-up for a pulmonary embolism that had resolved weeks ago. A formality. A box to check. The Admiral sat on the examination table, legs crossed at the ankles, hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone who'd been trained to control every visible inch of herself. Margaret prepared the vital station in silence. 3 years of invisibility had taught her the geometry of staying unnoticed, move along the walls, speak when addressed, let the doctors fill the rooms with their voices. The Admiral watched her work. There was something in that gaze, a recognition Margaret couldn't place. The younger woman's eyes tracked Margaret's hands as she fastened the blood pressure cuff, as if trying to solve an equation written in muscle memory and scarred knuckles. "You served," Admiral Chen said. "Not a question." Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. Composure. Steady breath. "Just a nurse, Admiral." "Your walk." The Admiral's voice dropped, intimate in a way that made the small room feel smaller. "That's not hospital training. That's formation. 20 years, and I still recognize it." Before Margaret could answer, Dr. Caldwell pushed through the door with a chart tucked under his arm and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't acknowledge the Admiral's rank beyond a cursory nod. Just another patient. Just another 30 minutes of his schedule. Margaret stepped back into the corner, the place she'd learned to occupy, where she could observe but not intrude. Where she could watch. Caldwell reviewed the chart with the deliberate slowness of someone performing competence. He scanned the EKG results, the chest X-ray, the D-dimer levels. His eyes moved across each line item with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Margaret had watched him miss details before. Never critical ones. Never ones that mattered. But cardiologists relied on pattern recognition. What they expected to see, they saw. What didn't fit the expected narrative, they overlooked. The Admiral's most recent chest imaging was there. Clear lung fields. No infiltrates. The follow-up labs were unremarkable. Normal. Everything normal. Caldwell's pen moved across the chart in small check marks. Clearance pending. Everything resolved. Next patient. But Margaret had noticed something 3 minutes earlier while taking the vital signs. A slight elevation in the Admiral's respiratory rate. 32 breaths per minute instead of the expected 20. The oxygen saturation was 96%, technically acceptable, but a downward trend from the previous week's reading of 98. Nothing that would trigger alarm bells. Nothing that would make a doctor pause. Just small variations in the normal range, like the way a car engine might sound slightly different before it fails completely. Margaret had lived in her body long enough to understand that subtle things killed people. In the desert, it was the almost invisible change in wind direction. In hospital corridors, it was the slight alteration in a patient's breathing pattern. Pain was data. Small variations were warnings. Caldwell stood. "Everything looks good, Admiral. You're cleared to resume full duty. No restrictions." He was moving toward the door when Admiral Chen suddenly gasped. Not a dramatic collapse. Something far worse, the body's quiet betrayal. Her hand clutched the edge of the examination table. Her mouth opened as if searching for something that wasn't there. Air. Oxygen. The currency of life itself. The color drained from her face in a way that made time collapse. Margaret was already moving before the Admiral's body listed sideways. Not running. Running would be panic. Margaret moved like someone who'd made this exact decision 1,000 times before, who'd chosen action over hesitation in moments when hesitation meant body bags. "Code," Margaret said. Her voice dropped an octave. Lost the hospital softness and found the command structure underneath. Tension pneumothorax. Get crash cart. Now. Caldwell froze. He was still holding the chart, his fingers locked around the metal clipboard like a man drowning. The two residents who'd been standing near the doorway exchanged glances of confusion. Was this Margaret Walsh, the night nurse everyone ignored, or was this someone else wearing her scrubs? Margaret had already peeled back the Admiral's uniform. The dress whites came apart like tissue. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this while mortars fell, who triaged blood loss while counting down the minutes until medevac. The Admiral's chest rose and fell with the desperate shallowness of a fish dragged from water. Second intercostal space, Margaret said to no one and everyone. Midclavicular line. 14-gauge angiocath. One of the residents scrambled for the crash cart. The other stood paralyzed, his clipboard still in his hands. Caldwell remained in the doorway, watching as if this were a television show happening to other people in another hospital far away. Margaret's fingers found the landmarks. The slight hollow below the collarbone. The ribcage's architecture laid bare by 3 years of military field medicine and 2 decades of suppressed muscle memory. She located the second intercostal space with the certainty of someone returning to a place she'd never really left. Her hands found the needle. The angiocath slid in with a whisper of resistance. The hiss came immediately. Air escaping. The sound of pressure releasing. The Admiral's body gasped, a real breath this time, not the desperate shallow panting of seconds before. Her oxygen saturation was already climbing. 82%. 85%. The monitor's beeping accelerated into a rhythm that resembled something close to life. Margaret's hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The physical effort of keeping herself in the present moment instead of sliding backward into the desert, into the field hospital at Forward Operating Base Shank where she'd saved 17 soldiers on a Tuesday that never ended, where she'd performed her last needle decompression before the IED took her hip and her name and her place in the world where people understood what she'd done. 90%. 92%. The Admiral's eyes flickered open. Her breathing deepened. Oxygen saturation climbing toward the normal range like a climber returning to altitude where humans could survive. The crash cart arrived. The resident started chest compressions before Margaret could tell him it wasn't necessary. The Admiral's heart had never stopped, her lungs had simply been crushed by air in the wrong space, pressure in the cavity between her lung and her chest wall, the kind of invisible killer that doctors missed because it didn't appear on the initial assessment, because Caldwell had been reading the wrong part of the chart. Because he'd seen what he expected to see instead of what was actually killing her. Margaret stepped back. The room erupted into the organized chaos of a medical emergency being properly managed now that the crisis had passed its worst point. Residents called for additional supplies. A nurse started an full line. Someone ran for the attending physician from the ICU. The Admiral's color returned, that particular shade of human pink that meant oxygenated blood was reaching her brain again. That meant survival was no longer a question mark. Within the hour, the hallway outside room 447 had transformed into something resembling a military installation. Navy personnel stood at attention in their dress uniforms. The attending physicians huddled in small clusters, their voices dropped to the urgent whispers reserved for situations that could have ended very differently. The chief of staff appeared. Then the hospital administrator. Nobody called Margaret over to explain what had happened. Nobody asked her how she'd known what to do, or where she'd learned the procedure, or why her voice had changed in that moment from the soft, careful diction of a hospital employee into something sharper and more certain, the kind of voice that made people obey without question. She stood at the nurse's station and watched from the periphery. This was the place she'd learned to occupy. The edges. The corners. The spaces where she could observe without being observed, where she could maintain the distance that made invisibility possible. But the Admiral's eyes had found hers across the chaos. Had held her gaze for just long enough to confirm what both of them suddenly seemed to understand. That Margaret had just saved her life twice. That recognition was a luxury neither of them could afford in this moment, not with Dr. Caldwell still standing in the doorway, his face the color of old paper, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped his clipboard. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. Within an hour, Caldwell had made 4 phone calls. The first went to the credentialing committee, his voice smooth as oil as he questioned Margaret's unexplained employment gaps and suggested the military service on her application might be falsified. The second call reached HR, where he requested an immediate performance review, citing erratic decision-making and insubordination in a critical moment. The third call was personal, his mentor on the hospital board, who listened without interrupting while Caldwell explained that Margaret had created chaos and frightened patients with her unauthorized needle decompression. The fourth call was the coup. He phoned the nursing director and requested Margaret's immediate reassignment to the overnight psychiatric unit effective immediately, claiming it would be a better fit for her experience level and remove her from the high-acuity cardiac setting where she'd overstepped her authority. Nobody told Margaret about the calls. They didn't have to. She watched the glances between staff members during shift change. She saw the printout on the bulletin board, her reassignment, official and laminated. She felt the weight of it the way soldiers feel incoming fire, before the rounds actually hit. 2 days later, Caldwell handed her a manila envelope in the hallway outside the nurse's station. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather. His hands didn't shake at all. The termination letter inside cited insubordination and failure to respect chain of command, referencing the written reprimand he'd posted weeks earlier, the ones from the medication incident and the dressing down in front of Patterson's family. There were new allegations too, creating a hostile work environment, unauthorized medical intervention, disregarding physician orders. Every word was careful. Every allegation was constructed. Nothing mentioned the life she'd saved. Nothing mentioned that she'd been right. Margaret read it once. She didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. She simply folded the letter and walked to her locker, pulled out the items she'd accumulated over 3 years, a stethoscope, a small photo of a sunset she'd cut from a magazine, a sweater someone had left behind that fit her perfectly, and placed them in a cardboard box that had once held for bags. Her movements were mechanical. Her face was the color of old concrete. That evening, she stood at a rain-soaked bus stop on Westheimer Road. The cardboard box sat on her hip, already softening with moisture. Houston's humidity turned the air into something thick you could almost drink, but the rain still fell sideways, insistent and cold. Her shoes were soaked through. Her scrubs, still damp from the day shift she wasn't supposed to have worked, clung to her legs like a skin she couldn't shed. Inside the box was the cracked mug someone had given her during her first week at Seattle General. "World's okayest nurse," it read in faded letters, the words chipped around the rim. There was a dying succulent that had somehow survived in her locker for 18 months, its leaves already browning at the edges, now dropping one by one into a puddle pooling at the bottom of the box. The plastic pot had cracked months ago. Nobody had bothered to throw it away, and Margaret had never had the heart to do it either. And there was the photograph, her medic unit from Tikrit, 23 faces arranged in rows outside the field hospital tent in 2003. Half of them were dead now. Hernandez, who took 3 rounds during a supply run. Reeves, who made it home and drove his car off a bridge in 2008. Martinez, Rodriguez, Thompson. The others had scattered into civilian life like seeds blown from a dead tree, and Margaret hadn't heard from most of them in over a decade. The photograph was water-stained, the faces faded to ghosts. She pulled it out and stared at it. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was front and center, his arm around her shoulders, that crooked grin he'd had before the promotion changed him. She'd seen him twice since the discharge, both times at Walter Reed, both times they'd known there was nothing left to say. The girl next to him was Captain Holloway, call sign Breaker. Margaret had heard through someone's brother's friend that Breaker was teaching at a medical college now, doing fine, married with kids. The woman who looked like she was about to laugh in the photo, that was Sergeant First Class Gator. She'd been the first one to die. IED, Sanjin Valley, 2004. Margaret had been holding her hand when they loaded her onto the medevac bird. These women had been her world. Her sisters. The people who understood the weight of keeping someone alive when everything was trying to kill them. And now they were names in faded photographs or not even that, just ghosts in her memory, faces she was already starting to forget the sound of. The bus pulled up but didn't stop. The driver had the door closed, the rain too heavy, too many people already inside. The vehicle sprayed through the puddle as it passed, soaking Margaret's shoes further, kicking up spray that mixed with her own sweat and the rain that wouldn't stop falling. She didn't step back. She didn't curse. She simply watched the bus disappear into the Houston night. Margaret thought about Admiral Chen. She thought about the way the Admiral had studied her name tag, the way her hand had trembled slightly when she squeezed Margaret's arm after the procedure. There had been something in that grip, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of recognition. But Margaret had been too focused on the O2 readings, on the stabilization, on keeping the woman alive long enough to reach the psycho. She hadn't looked back. She never looked back. She set the box down on the bench, ignoring the way the wet would soaked into her scrub pants. Her hip screamed when she bent to reach inside the box, the same hip that had taken shrapnel in 2004, that had been reconstructed 3 times, that still sent lightning bolts of pain down her leg on days when the weather shifted. The pain was information. Pain told her she was still alive. Pain was data. Her fingers found the unit patch inside the lining of her jacket, the place where she'd sewn it 20 years ago, when the army had processed her discharge paperwork and told her she'd never deploy again, that her medical profile was permanent, that some wounds were too deep to fix. The 10th Mountain Division insignia was barely visible now, faded to the color of old bone. She pulled the jacket loose and looked at the stitching she'd done herself, one-handed in the hospital ward at Walter Reed, using a needle and green thread she'd found in a supply closet. The patch had been on a captured Taliban uniform. A trophy. A reminder. She'd never told anyone where it came from. She remembered sewing it. She remembered thinking that if she couldn't be a soldier anymore, at least she could carry the weight of being one. At least she could wake up knowing what she'd been, what she'd sacrificed, what she'd lost, what she'd saved. The Bronze Star was in a box somewhere, probably still in the storage unit her sister had rented after the discharge. Margaret had never opened that box. Opening it meant admitting that version of herself was gone. As long as the box stayed sealed, she could pretend the Major was still in there, just resting. But the Major was tired. The Major was broken. The Major had been staring at a cracked coffee mug in the rain for 10 minutes, trying to remember how to move forward when there was no forward anymore, just a studio apartment in Montrose, a part-time job at a coffee shop if they'd have her, food stamps, and the slow erosion of hope that looked like leaves dropping off a dying plant. She pulled out the photograph again. The girl in it, the one with the bright eyes and the bandage on her jaw from a close call in Fallujah, was so young. 23 years old. Scared but hiding it. In love with the work, in love with the mission, in love with the idea that what you did mattered, that the lives you saved were real and would stay saved, that the sacrifices added up to something that wouldn't just evaporate the moment you hung up your uniform. That girl was dead. That girl had died the night the IED exploded beneath the Humvee and shattered her hip and took her career and left her with scars that never fully healed and a liver full of medication and pain that was now just part of the furniture of her body. This woman, the one standing at a bus stop in Houston, holding a cardboard box full of dead weight, was what was left after the fire burned out. Another bus came. It stopped. Margaret picked up the box, moved to the shelter, and waited for the next one. The rain hammered against the plastic roof like mortar fire. The succulent had now completely tipped over, all its leaves scattered in the cardboard bottom. The mug was collecting rainwater. The photograph was getting darker with moisture. She would go home. She would update her resume, delete any mention of the military because employers saw that and thought fragile, thought unstable, thought trauma. She would apply to the overnight shift at a different hospital, somewhere where Dr. Caldwell's reach didn't extend, where nobody knew about the needle decompression or the way she'd barked orders or the Admiral's hand on her arm. She would become invisible again. She would survive the way survivors always do, quietly, without complaint, asking for nothing, accepting less. This was what it meant to be reborn. Not with fanfare. Not with recognition. just alone at a bus stop, watching the life you'd rebuilt crumble like a succulent in a broken pot, understanding that some wounds never stop bleeding, that asking people to witness your history felt like begging, that the only way forward was to stop being Major and become simply Margaret again, just a nurse, just a civilian, just a woman waiting for a bus that would take her someplace else. The next bus had room. She got on. She didn't look back at the puddle where the succulent's last leaf was floating like a small green goodbye. And that was when her phone rang. Her phone rang while the rain was still falling on the parking lot, the screen glowing with a number she didn't recognize. Margaret answered on the second ring, water dripping from her hair onto the cardboard box balanced against her hip. The voice on the other end was clipped, official, the kind of tone that came from someone used to giving orders. Major Walsh? This is Captain Lisa Morrison from Naval Medical Command. We need you at Seattle General. Now. Margaret had hung up the phone, set the box down on the bench beside her, and walked back into the hospital without changing her clothes. The conference room was on the administrative floor, the kind of space where decisions that mattered were made in climate-controlled silence. Margaret sat in a grey fabric chair across from 8 people she'd never seen before. The Chief of Staff, Dr. Reynolds, sat at the head of the table with a sealed file in front of him, the red stamp across its cover reading classified. To his left was the hospital's legal counsel, a woman with silver glasses and a jaw like polished stone. To his right were 2 officers in navy dress uniforms, their insignia catching the fluorescent light like promises of reckoning. Margaret's hands were steady on the table. Her breathing was measured. The composure that had carried her through mortar fire and mass casualty triage held. Your background check triggered a security protocol, Dr. Reynolds said, his voice careful. The sealed file came directly from the Pentagon. We opened it this morning. He slid the folder across the table. Margaret didn't open it. She didn't need to. Whatever was written in that file was already written in her hands, in the surgical precision of her movements, in the way she'd barked orders like a field commander when Admiral Chen's oxygen saturation dropped from 84 to 61 in the span of a heartbeat. I understand, sir, she said. The words came out level, unhurried. The conference room door opened. Admiral Sarah Chen walked in wearing dress whites, a uniform sharp as a scalpel, her chest bearing ribbons Margaret recognized, a sailor who'd seen combat, who'd been forged in the same fires. Chen's eyes found Margaret's across the table, and in that single moment, something shifted in the room's air pressure. The Admiral's hand trembled slightly as she placed both palms on the table. Major Walsh saved my life twice, Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of official testimony. Once in Tikrit when I was 8 years old. My father was the interpreter for her convoy. There was an IED strike. The vehicle caught fire. Major Walsh pulled me out. Chen's jaw tightened. She held my hand while the medevac Black Hawk landed. She told me my father was proud of me. She was lying. My father didn't survive. But she gave me 3 minutes of believing he did. The Admiral's voice cracked like breaking ice. And 3 days ago, when your doctor missed the pulmonary embolism on my chart, when my lung collapsed in room 447, that same officer saved my life again. She performed an emergency needle decompression using a 14-gauge angiocath and an MRE seal, improvised equipment designed to re-expand a tension pneumothorax. She barked orders like the combat medic she is. Your residents froze. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway. She was the only one who moved. A Navy SEAL commander stood from the chair to Margaret's left, his presence moving through the room like a tide shift. His face was scarred, a ragged line from temple to jaw that spoke of IED fragmentation, of survival against mathematics that should have been fatal. I'm Commander Joel Graves, former commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I reviewed this file with Captain Morrison. He turned to face the table, his eyes moving across the faces of the hospital administrators like he was assessing a hostile position. Major Margaret Walsh, United States Army Medical Corps, served with distinction for 23 years across 5 combat tours. His voice carried the gravel of authority earned in dust and blood. She commanded forward surgical teams. She trained over 200 combat medics. She saved 314 lives in direct contact operations. He paused, letting the number settle into the silence. Her first decoration, the Army Commendation Medal. The room absorbed this. Her second, the Meritorious Service Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Graves's voice dropped, moving into registers that made the fluorescent lights seem to hum louder. The Combat Medical Badge with 2 bronze stars. Another pause. 2 purple hearts. He let those words hang like smoke. And the bronze star with Valor, for refusing evacuation after a blast that shattered her hip, remaining conscious to direct ongoing operations under sustained fire until all personnel were secured. The silence was so thick you could operate in it, Margaret thought. This was how the world felt under mortar fire, suspended, holding its breath. The head nurse, Linda, the woman who'd walked away from the break room coffee station 100 times, whose eyes had learned to look through Margaret like she was a ghost, read from the file with trembling hands. 72 hours of continuous field operations at Forward Operating Base Shank. No relief. No break. Linda's voice was barely audible. 2 medevac missions under active fire. Multiple casualties treated in a tent with wounded insurgents separated by nothing but canvas. Major Walsh managed triage, surgical assistance, anesthesia rotation, and medical supply inventory while hemorrhaging from a wound she didn't report until after the 3rd day. Linda looked up from the page, and Margaret saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before, not pity, something steadier. Recognition. The kind that comes from understanding you've been standing next to a lion while calling it a house cat. There's a formal letter from General Marcus Vance, her commanding officer. He writes, Major Walsh exemplifies the highest standards of military medicine and personal integrity. Her service record stands without peer. Dr. Caldwell was not in the room. Margaret had realized this 5 minutes in, when she'd catalogued the present faces and found him absent. His absence was louder than any speech he could have given. His absence meant someone had already made a choice. His absence meant the power he'd built, the kind that came from professional reputation, from careful documentation, from allies in administrative positions, was already crumbling. Margaret could almost see it happening, the way institutional authority collapses when confronted with a higher order, the way a man who'd climbed the hospital hierarchy discovered he'd been climbing the wrong mountain entirely. The Chief of Staff cleared his throat. We've terminated Dr. Caldwell's privileges effective immediately. The hospital board voted unanimously this morning, pending a formal ethics investigation. We will be paying you full back wages, a settlement of $124,000, and offering you a promotion to clinical educator with a base salary increase. Reynolds paused, watching Margaret's face, but Margaret's face was a still pond reflecting nothing but sky. The nurses who participated in the ostracism have been required to attend bias training. We've also committed to mandatory military competency modules for all attending physicians. He slid another document across the table. And we'd like to formally apologize, Major Walsh, for allowing an environment where you felt you had to hide who you are. Margaret took the document. She read it carefully, every word, because this was the kind of thing that needed to be witnessed and recorded in memory. When she finished, she set it down with precise movements. I accept the reinstatement and the conditions. I want to teach, Dr. Reynolds. I want to build a program that ensures no one else walks these hallways feeling like they have to disappear. Her voice, when it came, was the voice of someone who'd made decisions under fire, who understood the weight of leadership, who'd learned that silence was sometimes mercy and sometimes erasure. There was no tremor in it. There was no apology in it. There was only clarity, like a scalpel cutting through uncertainty. When do I start? 6 months later, Margaret walked past a strip mall on the corner of Houston and Main, her limp less pronounced now that she'd finally gotten the hip surgery she'd been delaying for 11 years. She wore scrubs with clinical educator embroidered on the pocket. A banner sagged above a folding table in one of the storefronts, Affordable Insurance Solutions, Ask Me How. Behind the table, Dr. Caldwell sat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to convince themselves the water isn't rising. His suit was rumpled, coffee-stained at the cuff. His hair was grayer than it had been, thinned at the temples in a way that suggested stress-induced alopecia or simply the visual manifestation of watching everything you'd built burn to ash in 6 months. Their eyes met through the window glass. Margaret saw the moment he recognized her, saw his pupils dilate, saw his jaw tighten, saw the calculation move behind his eyes as he weighed whether to nod or to look away. He looked away. His shoulders curved inward. He turned his body slightly in the chair, making himself smaller, making himself unremarkable. Margaret continued walking. She felt no anger at this sight. She felt no satisfaction watching him sell insurance from a folding table, his former position at Seattle General now just a cautionary tale told in medical conferences, in hospital corridors where young doctors learned that hubris was indistinguishable from professional suicide. She felt nothing except the weight of Admiral Chen's hand on her shoulder that morning 6 months ago, the younger woman's voice close against her ear. "I never forgot your voice, Major. It's the last thing I heard before I thought the world was ending. And the first thing that made me believe I was going to live." That was when Margaret finally understood something fundamental about carrying secrets. You didn't carry them to protect yourself. You carried them because you'd been taught that your pain was an inconvenience to others, that your accomplishments diminished people less accomplished, that taking up space with your history was an act of cruelty. But standing in that conference room, surrounded by officers and administrators and the ghost of a man who'd tried to erase her, Margaret had learned that hiding your strength wasn't humility. It was erosion. It was the slow dissolution of self that came from teaching the world it was acceptable to diminish you. She walked toward Seattle General, where her photograph hung now in the Veterans Recognition Hallway, where residents came to her asking for clinical expertise, where nurses sought her mentorship instead of engineered her isolation. The rain was starting again, but Margaret didn't think about bus stops this time. She didn't think about cardboard boxes or cracked nurse mugs or water-stained photographs of the dead. She thought about the young night nurse who'd approached her the day before, whose attending physician had called her slow and incompetent during rounds. Margaret had placed a hand on that nurse's shoulder and said, "True class is what you do when the lights go out. Never let someone else's blindness dim who you are." That young nurse was going to be fine. She was going to survive. And maybe, Margaret thought as she pushed through the hospital doors, that was the real victory, not the medals that had been read aloud in that conference room, not the termination of a man who'd tried to break her, but the fact that somewhere inside, a quieter person than Margaret had ever been would stand a little straighter tomorrow. Would speak a little louder. Would understand that worth wasn't granted by institutional authority. Worth was something you carried inside yourself, something that survived being invisible, something that emerged intact when the world finally learned to look. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And we always love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell us what state or country you're in.